We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin.
Hi, my name is Lloyd, and we have here with us Michael Morris, and this is part one of a 10-part web series in which we'll be discussing various aspects of the political climate and certain issues focused on American politics, called This is America. In this first part of the video series, we'll be discussing a very hotly debated and very controversial issue, and that is the issue of taxes. It's a very important discussion going on from both parties, whether they're good or bad. So the first start-off question we'll have today for you, Mike, is what is the importance of taxes?
Well, taxes are essentially the bedrock of a civil society, at least a modern society. Taxes pay for a significant amount of the things that you find comfortable or necessary in modern life. Your roads are paid for taxes, the interstate, the police are paid for by your taxes, firefighters, the military. Your food is made sure that it's clean because the Food and Drug Administration, which is funded by taxes, goes and puts regulations on food corporations to make sure that you don't get botulism, at least to the extent that you would have in, say, the 19th century. The CDC uses tax money to research diseases. Essentially, taxes are what you as a citizen pay to the government which represents you under a democracy so that society as a whole can better itself. It provides for the general welfare of the public. There's a lot of people who feel like they don't want their taxes taken, they don't want their money taken away from them in the form of taxes, especially because they think that it then gets spent on other people unfairly or unjustly. They think other people mooch off the system. While this may happen to a certain extent, what's really important about taxation is that it underlies all of the most basic elements of a modern state. There would be no real social safety net in this country if it weren't for taxes, because that's how you pay for Social Security, that's how you pay for Medicare, Medicaid, all of these necessary things that make sure that you live in a first world country and not in a third world country.
All right, we've gotten a clear understanding about the importance of taxes. Now, taking that into consideration, do you feel, Mr. Morris, that taxes are too high?
No, that's a sort of conservative smear that's always been popular over the past 30 years, especially among people like Grover Norquist, whose whole idea is he wants to shrink government to make it so small that he could strangle it in a bathtub, is what he said. So he wants to lower the tax rate to such a minuscule level that the government can't even function, which is what we're essentially seeing now. The conservatives are sort of winning in that strategy that they were promoting 30 years ago when Reagan first came onto the national scene. Taxes are historically, they're at historical low rates right now under the Obama presidency. He cut taxes for pretty much the whole middle class and the poor. The people who really complain about taxes being too high are invariably the rich. They use their media sources, particularly Fox and right-wing talk radio, to be able to seep that sort of dialogue into the middle class. And it's true that the middle class is currently suffering under terrible economic conditions, and so it's understandable why people in the middle class would feel like they're not getting as much money back, or rather that their taxes are too high, because they're suffering to the point that it's understandable that they would need to have their taxes lowered. But in reality, like I said, taxes are at historical low rates, especially on the rich. Now, if you look back, say at the Reagan administration, the tax rates under Reagan on the top tax bracket were much higher than they currently are today under the Obama presidency. If you look back at the Eisenhower presidency, top tax bracket was something like 91% income tax. Now, because of loopholes, that wasn't the actual effective tax rate, but even with the effective tax rate was still much higher than what the effective tax rate is today. And there's a difference between the official tax rate and the effective tax rate, because we can see in the example of GE and other such corporations that America may have one of the highest corporate income tax rates technically, but because there's so many loopholes, they're able to get out of it. GE, it was either earlier this year or last year, they paid no money, $0 in taxes, income taxes to the government, despite the fact that they're a multi-million or billion-dollar corporation. It's very hard under such circumstances to argue that tax rates are too high when they are, factually speaking, simply lower than they have been in the past. And the people who are the main proponents of lowering taxes even further, who are essentially the rich, are swimming in money as it is.
All right, so there's pretty much this agreement across the board that tax reformation is needed and necessary. How do you feel about then having tax rates being the same rate across all tax brackets as opposed to having different taxation rates depending on what tax bracket you fall into?
Well, that's what they call the fair tax, which is a very nice, very Orwellian, frankly, phrase. The idea sounds really nice to American ears because it sounds very equal. Everybody has a flat tax rate across the board, no matter what your class is, really. Although we like to not talk about class in this country, we'll just say across the tax bracket that you're in. In reality, it's a very regressive tax because what it means is the rich make off like bandits while the poor have to pay rather higher taxes than what they pay now. The lowest tax bracket in this country is obviously nowhere near the highest tax bracket in terms of what they bring in. So in a progressive taxation scheme, what you have is the people who make less pay less taxes. The people who make more pay more taxes because they can afford to. If you have a flat tax across the board, not a flat tax, but a flat rate across the board, a fair tax, what that means is, proportionally speaking, the rich will end up paying far less while the poor will end up paying far more. That's going to put a lot more pressure on the poor because they need all of the money that they bring in as income. They can't afford to give all of that away in taxes like the rich can because they need to go out and buy their food, they need to support their families, whereas the rich can already take all that money they make and just sock it away in a bank. So it's just a rather unfair system that shifts the burden of taxation away from the rich and onto the poor and the middle class. And in that way, despite the fact that it sounds rather egalitarian, it's the complete opposite. A progressive tax system, like I said, is a far more egalitarian system and a far more fair one.
Well, this concludes part 1 of our 10-part series called This is America. Join us again next week when we will be discussing the topic of the debt ceiling. Thank you very much.